I normally get asked to talk about economic subjects, so I thought it'd be quite good for me, possibly of interest to you, to get into a slightly wider agenda. And I think the question which is interesting in a way, which is why this whole constitutional agenda has run into the sand. Well, what's happened? What lies behind it? But we can make accusations and party political points, but I don't think that's what we're here for, is it? It's really to try to understand what's happened. The AB referendum failed. The House of Lords reform has gone nowhere. It's all sort of ground to a halt. And what I think, in the late 1990s, we thought of as the sort of small foothills of constitutional reform, like partial devolution, are now beginning to look like the peaks of the mountains. So, where has it all gone wrong? And I think, in trying to answer that, I think what I will try to do is look at what are some of the deeper underlying contextual things that are happening. And I want to look at three things in particular, one of which is the rise of what I call the politics of identity. A second of which is the paradox that as the ideological divide between parties narrows, relations between parties become more fractious and less cooperative. It's a paradox that we need to think about a bit, I think. And I think the third is trying to pursue political constitution reform in the context of economic crisis. And I want to say a little bit about each of those, and then move from that to suggest some of the areas we should perhaps concentrate on, which are priorities, rather than just going over old stuff about changing structures, which may not be the best way of approaching these things. Let me just start with the politics of identity. I want to go back to something I wrote, which was almost 2 decades ago. I sort of wrote this little piece called The World's New Fishers, and then rewrote it a few years later for a think tank called Demos. And it was an attempt to explain and predict what would happen to politics in the wake of the ending of the Cold War, when politics, the whole organising principle around left and right, which we all lived with, in my case probably longer than many of you, was if not dissolving, was becoming much less important. And I think the propositions behind it were still basically true, that whereas a generation ago you can have a really good and often quite conflictual debate between right and left on basic principles around equality, around class, around public ownership. All those things have become narrower, in a way less interesting, and less salient in public life. If you take an area like public ownership, and some of you remember general elections were fought over whether the steel industry should be nationalised or not. But I was just reflecting that of all the many things I've been involved in government, and I'm involved in an awful lot of very controversial issues, the one that attracted absolutely no interest whatever was shifting Royal Mail into the private ownership through legislation we passed in Parliament. I mean, nobody was terribly interested. It was just a minor change. In the days when public versus private ownership meant something, it was a major difference. Or if you take an issue like social class, I mean, we're having all these comments at the moment about old Etonians in positions of power in the church as well as politics, but it's morely done in the context of humour, or, if one lacks humour, kind of mild irritation. The idea that you go out and kill people because of their social class is a kind of distant position. So, I mean, although those things still matter, and they do matter, it's no longer a kind of fundamental principle around which politics revolves. So the question then is what's replaced it, or what's replacing it? And I argued in this pamphlet that what was beginning to replace it was something that I call the politics of identity, where increasingly, some people anyway, were thinking in terms of narrow exclusive groups based on religion or language or race in some cases. Others were learning to adapt to a kind of multicultural world, a world of multiple identity. And this was the kind of issues around which politics was going to coalesce. Now, if you look at things at the moment, that isn't quite right. I mean, that clearly doesn't dominate the political agenda. We're still, in this country, in the United States and other countries, concerned with basic economic arguments and economic competence and how you resolve the economic crisis. That's the number one issue. But if you look beneath the surface, all the other issues which matter and which people get very steamed up about tend to be identity issues. I mean, north of the border, we're faced with, you know, a very, very important question about whether the United Kingdom continues or not. A debate that we last had, you know, 300 years ago, and it's now, you know, the question about whether our country survives in the way it traditionally has. That's an issue we're going to debate for the next 2 years. Enormously important question. Of course, it's centred in Scotland, but England and the rest of the UK has to respond to that. So, and that's a fundamental question of identity and where we belong and who we think we are. And similarly, Europe. You know, the whole question about whether we are Europeans or belong to the Union or participate in some level is becoming, well, it has been for a long time, but is re-emerging as an absolutely fundamental question, you know, an existential question, not just a question about particular tactical issues. And an issue like immigration, which is always there in all the public opinion surveys, shows up as usually number 2 or number 3 on the list of voters' priorities. Now, these are all issues around identity, and they don't form any single axis, but I think it's probably fair to say that many of these things have replaced the things that a generation ago that we used to be preoccupied with in terms of traditional arguments about left and right. And it's all anyway becoming rather muddled. And it isn't terribly clear how you categorise politics anymore when these things become important. And if you look at the United States election, well, of course, the big issue was, I suppose, management of the economy, but not far below the surface was ethnicity. The fact that Hispanics saw themselves as a powerful ethnic group and voted accordingly in terms of what was in their interests as an ethnic group, and how different parties treated them in terms of their approach to migration. And for large numbers of mainly white electorate, religion, you know, extremely powerful driver, and how people responded to issues like gay marriage and abortion, not very far below the surface. So politics is becoming, if not totally dominated by, certainly heavily influenced by these issues around identity. And I think we might have to, you know, in a way recast the political debate in terms of those issues and how we respond to them and how they're captured. I think the second of the new trends that I would describe is this, that partly because the traditional left-right axis has become much narrower, and because we don't, I mean, between sort of mainstream Conservatives, mainstream Labour and my own party, there isn't an enormous, you know, we have quite heated arguments, but they're not sort of fundamental civil war type arguments over public ownership or taxation, even the boundaries of the state. I mean, people get very heated about it sometimes, but actually the share of the government in GDP is actually increasing at the moment. It's not decreasing, more by accident than design, but it is happening. So, but as the boundaries become narrower, the conflict between parties is becoming in many ways worse, more angry, more fractious. And it struck me as somebody who was in the coalition that although we, you know, I have quite, you know, strong intellectual differences with Conservatives in the coalition about policy questions, the issues that have really made people angry with each other have been about the constitutional reform issues like AV and the House of Lords and the linked issue of boundaries. So, and why is that? Well, actually because it's about power. It's about who controls power, our party or another party, and all that goes with that in terms of patronage and support and being able to make decisions. So as the ideological divide has become less or more confused because it's mixed up with all these identity issues, so it's become progressively more difficult to get accommodation on the constitutional reform agenda, because we're now getting very close to the existence of political parties and what they're there for, and their spheres of influence and their control over events. And this is why it is actually now proving virtually impossible to get agreement on any of the constitutional reform issues. And I think the third contextual issue to think about is the fact that we're trying to pursue all these arguments at a time of economic crisis. Very profound. I don't want to hit them. I've spoken many times before about the causes of this crisis and its consequences. This is not the place for that. But simply to note, that we have had what I've often called the economic equivalent of a heart attack. It's desperately damaging. It's caused great damage. It's going to continue for a long time. People running government, not just in our country, but other Western countries, are going to be preoccupied with these issues. Now, the effect it's had on the debate about constitutional reform is, of course, that it's actually much more difficult to get people to focus on it. The most damning argument that always surfaced when we were talking about House of Lords reform, people who didn't want to do anything, was to say, well, surely, come on, people out on the doorstep, what do they care about House of Lords reform? Come on, pull the other one. That was the kind of satirical ridicule that would be advanced in relation to any change in our constitutional arrangements. And linked to that, people who are genuinely angry about what's going on, and there are a lot of people out there who are very, very angry because it's affecting them or because they disagree with it. This doesn't seem terribly relevant. Long-term structural changes, well, so what? We want to get out there and protest and show how angry we are. So it doesn't. The fact that we're living through a period of serious economic strain actually is making it more difficult to focus on democratic renewal. So I think those are sort of three things that are happening, interacting with each other, that make it quite difficult, I think, to pursue the traditional agenda that certainly my party's been very preoccupied with, and Charter 88 and your own organisation. So that's analysis. Where do we go from here? I don't have any magic solution, but I think there are three issues I would want to focus on. Instead of just saying, well, let's pursue the traditional structural changes, because that's what we've always said. I think I would start with more basic principles. What are the problems? And then we work from that to deciding what are the particular changes we want. And I think the three basic problems I would identify were over-centralisation, lack of participation, and corruption. Corruption with a small c. I know couldn't produce any sensational allegations about my colleagues or anything else. I think with a small c, because largely around the party funding issue. But in terms of centralisation, I think one of the things that does strike you when you're in government is how extraordinarily centralised the British system actually is, compared with almost every other Western democracy. Even countries like France, that we've always thought of as being rather Napoleonic and centrally driven, have a much more delegated system of government. And it's the one exception, of course, being devolution to Scotland, which has made a difference, and you will see that both the good and the bad side of devolution in Scotland is more of a parochial local goldfish bowl, but at the same time, there is a real sense of involvement and decentralisation of decision making, which you don't get in England. But centralisation, the stripping away of the powers of local government, which, and being very frank with you, my party came in to government, we shared with the Conservatives a decentralising agenda around planning, which of course is now a big U-turn and it's now re-centralising again. Nothing really has been done to halt the slide towards the centralisation of financing, though I think one small grain of optimism lies in these city deals. But nonetheless, I think the starting point is we have massively centralised government in the UK. It's highly inefficient, strips local people of any sense of real involvement in what's happening in their localities. And it even got to the stage where in local government, local councils now almost feeling that they're victims you know, if the library's closed, well, it must be somebody in government's fault. It's not our fault, even though we decided to do it. It's someone else up there who is responsible for all these things that are going wrong. And this is desperately debilitating and damaging, and I think everything we really have to, I think, now focus on how you decentralise in sensible ways. And I think there are two possible routes to this. The first is being opened up by Michael Heseltine. I don't know whether you've seen his paper, which is really good. I don't agree with everything in it, but he's you know, visionary, thoughtful, massively experienced. And he basically wants to just take large chunks of money from central government and just give it to localised bodies, and he wants to give them to local enterprise partnerships, which are basically partnerships of local council leaders and businesses, and just tell them to spend it. Acknowledges a lot of it will be wasted, but he argues it couldn't be wasted more than central government wasted. So let's just give them the money and get some decision making out into the provinces. Quite a bold approach, but the big problem with it, of course, is that these local enterprise partnerships aren't really accountable to anybody. They're just you know, artificially created structures. So the other approach would be to have much more decentralisation of revenue raising for local authorities. You know, local authorities aren't fashionable these days, councils, but the other way of doing it is to breathe more life into them, genuinely allow them greater freedom, both in terms of business taxation and personal taxation. We're getting a bit of that, as I say, with the city deals, but it's a very halting exercise. And I think we really ought to think creatively about how we accelerate that whole agenda, how you get back revenue raising as well as spending to decentralised authorities, whether it's kind of the nations of the UK like Scotland or local authorities, particularly in England. And I think there's a big gap there at the moment, which we need to try to fill. I think secondly, participation. I don't have anything terribly useful to say about this, but I think one of the really big problems we have is the younger generation basically just switching off and seeing no connection really between themselves and the political process. You know, the older generation tend to get quite excited by democratic reforms. I don't pick up any of this in the kind of younger generation that I tend to meet. Maybe I'm missing something. And maybe this is connected with one aspect of the politics of identity that, quite apart from the traditional divides in society around race or religion or whatever, you now have a big generational divide, which is becoming really quite severe. There's a very, very good book written by my ministerial colleague in Biz, David Willits, called The Pinch. A really good book, which makes it clear how my generation effectively ripping off younger people systematically through the housing market, through protecting pension arrangements, charging for education, so take a controversial area. And this is now becoming systematic and very serious. And if you're part of that younger generation, how do you exercise your control over this process? How do you stop it? Because, of course, older people will vote. They're well organised and well marshalled, and they hopelessly outnumber the younger voters. So how do the younger voters get themselves into the debate? How do they participate? Now, you know, there are a few simple mechanical things you could do by lowering voting age, which, you know, I think is a good idea, actually. It's a bit at the margin. But I think I have absolutely no answer to this problem at all. But I think unless we find some mechanism for engaging the next generation in the democratic process, you know, we're opening up a big hole, which will be very dangerous, and of course opens the political system to populism and other unhelpful trends. And I think the third area is what I call corruption with a small c. It's very striking that one of the areas where neither the last government nor this government have been able to reach any kind of compromise is over party funding. The next election will almost certainly be fought with billionaires throwing money at their favourite party and candidates. It will massively distort the outcome. We've seen this in the United States. Obama's, one of his great skills and triumphs was that he managed to offset the money politics of the other side. We haven't found a way of doing that in the UK. But if I were a campaigning group, I think worried about the future of democracy, I think this is the one area I would be more worried about than any other. That we are drifting to a situation where parties are losing their own membership base, and that applies to all of them. I mean, we have problems in my party, but all of them do. There is less and less inclination to contribute to politics financially by ordinary people. There is a quite understandable reluctance to have state funding, so the gap is being filled by, you know, the billionaires with vested interests. And if this is allowed to continue, the whole political system will be corrupted and poisoned to a dangerous level. So, you know, parties by themselves are not going to come to an accommodation on this because there are conflicts of interest. You know, do you bear down heaviest on the unions or the bosses or, you know, rich individuals, whatever. But unless there is real pressure on the parties, you know, we'll not get an agreement and the conversation will drift. So if I were targeting the #1 issue for political campaigning, it would be this one. Right, well that's all I want to say. I hope that's stirred you up if nothing else. And happy to answer questions. Thank you.